Welcome to Tria's webinar titled Specialty Management, Ensuring Long-Term Results. Thank you for joining us today. Just a couple of housekeeping reminders. We have a question and answer scheduled at the end of the presentation, so feel free to submit questions through the chat function. If you have any challenges throughout the presentation, feel free to also chat with our leaders through the chat function as well. My name is Jessica Lee. I am the CEO of Tria Health. I'm a pharmacist and an original founder with Tria Health. And I'm super excited to be joined today by Tyler Page. Tyler is a clinical pharmacist at Tria Health. He, in addition to having his Doctor of Pharmacy, also is a certified diabetic educator and additionally has a certified specialty pharmacist designation as well. Tyler comes to us with extensive experience serving prior to his role here in a specialty pharmacy, and additionally a lot of chronic condition management experience. Welcome, Tyler.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start off by just talking a little bit about what Tria does. Tria is a chronic condition management company that targets the source of healthcare costs. We know that chronic conditions are a huge portion of healthcare costs, mostly driven by individuals who have one or more chronic conditions in the United States. You can see based on the chart to the right corner that multiple chronic conditions leads to cost multipliers. That means you're spending multiple amounts of money that is not just one more time, but 12 times more expensive if you have 5 or more chronic conditions. The other issue we have in the United States, and I'm sure it's not a unique problem, but a problem inherent in taking medications, is that people continue to achieve non-optimized medication use. This is a huge $528 billion problem in the United States. What do I mean by non-optimized medication use? Well, non-optimized medications can be medications who people aren't taking their medications at all, so non-adherence. If you're not taking your medication, you're obviously not being able to get the outcome. But sometimes it's more no fault, i.e. a drug-to-drug interaction where the medication's intended results are not happening because the two drugs are interacting with each other. Sometimes the dose isn't high enough or the right dose to be able to get the results. For example, if you've got a blood pressure medication and you're not taking the right dosage to get the blood pressure lowered to an adequate level to prevent stroke. Additionally, sometimes it's purely a different drug needed. Sometimes there's a unique individualized nature to drug choice in certain categories for treating diseases. And we can find that if you aren't using the right drug and not getting the outcomes, that obviously not only results in a cost of the medication, but also a cost of healthcare utilization for that individual whose chronic condition isn't being controlled. Tria employs pharmacists, and pharmacists are obviously experts in medication, and we'll see that today illustrated through Tyler's expertise with specialty medications. Medications are complex, and pharmacists have a unique opportunity to provide patients and physicians the opportunity to be experts in helping ensure appropriate medication usage, which drives great outcomes. We focus and target over 20 chronic conditions, and obviously the greatest impact is around many of those disease states that we all are aware of: diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol. But in the last several years, we listened to our plan sponsors who were continuing to be concerned about the cost of specialty conditions. And we have added the expertise of some of our pharmacists who are specialists now to include categories like inflammatory, HIV, Hep C, multiple sclerosis, and more. We'll talk a little bit about the role that the pharmacist plays in the specialty arena, but first I want to talk a little bit about specialty medications and what that means from a cost perspective. We know that prescription spending is rising faster than overall healthcare, and we obviously believe that's primarily related to specialty medications. Let's talk a little bit about what specialty medications are first. We know that the definition of specialty medications has evolved as the pipeline changes and expands. 10 to 12 years ago, specialty medications generally were defined as complex medications for chronic conditions. and generally requiring a specific advanced level of support. So injectables or infusions. Those definitions have been expanded a little bit now. Not only do we obviously focus on these complex conditions, but we have many drugs now that are considered specialty to focus on treating orphan diseases, which an orphan disease is a disease that affects a very small portion of the population. So we have these very unique biologic molecules that are focusing specifically on treating a disease or curing a disease or treating symptoms of a disease that really only affects a super small percentage of the entire population. Additionally, oral medications have really taken a hold in the specialty category as advancements are being made in certain disease states to have oral medications rather than injectables and infusions. What is unique, what is continuing to be true about the definition of specialty medications is that they are high cost. And a lot of them also require specific storage and particularly distribution channels across how they're being administered. Specialty medications represent less than 2% of utilization, but 48% of total drug spend. And that statistic is found from one of the largest pharmacy benefit managers. And that's not a surprise to anybody who's managing a benefit plan spend or budget. Specialty medications can be adjudicated in both medical and pharmacy. So we talked a little about infusions being specialty medications, and a lot of times those are being billed under the medical side. But many drugs now that we're seeing more of them being self-administered are being adjudicated on the pharmacy side. So in 2019, if you look at specialty medication claims, they account for about 14% of healthcare costs, excluding rebates, which is an interesting conversation that we can always talk about as we move forward a little bit into utilizing and managing techniques for managing costs with specialty. But pharmacy and medical, you're still seeing more costs per member per month on the pharmacy side than you are on the medical side. And this is just the drug costs. We're not even talking about the total impact of these particular disease states on their medical utilization outside of the drug specifically that's being used to treat these disease states. So we've obviously established that specialty is the primary reason for the increase in prescription drug spend. One of the biggest things that we're seeing in the pipeline from the FDA in terms of approval is that 66% of applications submitted are specialty, and 65% that are in late stage approval are specialty. So this particular category of drugs is a huge target for many pharmaceutical companies, and there's a lot of great things that are coming from it. We're seeing a lot of really great opportunities to treat diseases that we've never been able to treat before. Unfortunately, that takes a lot of effort and time and energy and money, and so that's where U.S. plan sponsors are unfortunately dealing with rising costs in specialty. If you look at your pharmacy benefit utilization reports, I'm guessing that this isn't unique to any one of you, but that many of you are dealing with the fact that out of the top 5 per member per month spending categories in private insurance, specialty drugs are a portion or a part of 4 of those 5 categories. Inflammatory conditions, a very broad category, includes rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. Oncology, obviously the cancer space is growing, and then multiple sclerosis and HIV. HIV occasionally will not be categorized depending on your pharmacy benefit manager as a specialty. A lot of times, if you look at complex molecules, HIV doesn't necessarily have a lot of complex molecules per se. A lot of those drugs are going generic, but it is a complex disease state that requires a lot of monitoring and management. So depending on how your pharmacy benefit manager classifies that drug, it may or may not be in the specialty category specifically. So what can you do? I think obviously pharmacy benefit managers are a good method to utilize some regulatory utilization management programs to ensure that you're controlling costs. And particularly we've seen over the last several years, in addition of the the fourth, fifth tier copay structures where specialty category drugs are charged at a percentage. So, you know, they may be, the member may be requiring to pay 20 to 30% of that drug, but what we know to be true is that specialty medications can range anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000 all the way up to 6 figures per dose. And so if you can imagine a $100,000 drug and having a 20% copay, that's just really difficult for many, many people to be able to decide that that's their choice of treating their disease state. Other things that pharmacy benefit managers do is they obviously have some significant formulary management channels, which involves rebates. And so rebates, many of these pharmaceutical companies do provide rebates to align drugs on the formulary, which can be obviously a cost savings for a plan, but we'll talk about some of the complications that come from formulary switching a little bit later as Tyler goes into what it's like to be a specialty patient taking specialty medications. Additionally, other ways of controlling costs, distribution channels. You know, obviously many times the specialty drugs, your pharmacy benefit manager is having your members access these drugs through a specific specialty pharmacy. Hopefully that's a way of helping ensure that you're having a good access to a discount. But lastly, the other thing is site of care conversations. And as we see more and more drugs moving into the self-injectable and oral category, it's a less of a conversation because many times now in disease states, we have the opportunity to choose a self-injectable oral drug, which many patients obviously would elect to. But we have seen over the last few years a lot of conversations around choosing a lowest costing site of care option for people who are taking infusible drugs. And sometimes that's as simple as having that member infuse that drug in their own home. But there's a complex conversation around site of care conversations, particularly as it relates to the disease state and the person and the fragility of their condition. So many a times, while that is an easy switch for people to just achieve getting those infusions at their home, sometimes it can be complicated as well. So there is some savings, but it can be a complicated conversation. So what does Tria do in light of specialty pharmacy? And I'm looking forward to having Tyler sort of develop some clarity around this, but Tria pharmacists are really focused on developing relationships with the patient. And we focus on the patient and who they are and help them manage the many conditions that they may have. We know that no person is in a silo with one disease state, and the differentiator for our pharmacists is that we're focused on the patient and understanding their conditions, their medications, and their journey. Our pharmacists are creating treatment plans in concert with their physicians and their patients, using evidence-based guidelines that are very clear, that help the member understand more about their conditions and their journey. Barriers to non-adherence are removed because we're able to understand specifically and individualize why that particular individual may have problems with non-adherence or non-optimization. We monitor specialty therapy effectiveness through rating scales and quality of life scales to ensure that not only are we as a clinical member of that conversation understanding how this drug is working for those members, but also the member and the physicians understand the journey of that medication and ensuring that it's optimized. Resolving gaps in care, ensuring that that the preventative services that these individuals are going through is optimizing that particular individual's health. And then finally, objective recommendations based on outcomes. Our pharmacists are helping members make better choices about their medications and ensuring that those are driving the best outcomes. That in turn allows us to report to our clients, and our clients are receiving robust reporting from Tria about financial outcomes related to the barriers that we're able to solve and improve for patients, not only from a medication choice perspective, but also their healthcare costs, and clinical outcomes as well can be reported to clients specifically. So I'm excited to hand it over to Tyler now. Tyler is going to talk a little bit about what it's like to be a patient in specialty management with Tria Health.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'd like to start off by just kind of putting ourselves in the shoes of a patient starting out in the specialty world. So when a doctor comes in and diagnoses them with a specialty condition, it could be a variety, you have multiple sclerosis, or someone tells you that you have Crohn's disease. A lot of times that's where the conversation ends. The next 10, 15, 20, what have you minutes that you're spending with a doctor are really spent listening intently. And as a result, it shouldn't come as a huge surprise. About 40 to 80% of that information is forgotten by the time they leave the office, if it was ever retained in the first place. And that's for a variety of reasons. There's a tendency to try to cope with the due diagnosis. For instance, you get Crohn's disease. How is this going to affect the rest of my life? What's this mean for me? What's this mean for tomorrow? What's this mean for a year from now? How am I going to get past this? Is the treatment worse than the condition itself? There are safety concerns with our medications, and patients might have been suspected them, might have even looked into them, that can really cause problems or cause misunderstandings with that. Why is it taking so long to approve the medication? Am I going to get it in time? Am I going to make it in time to really prevent some of these huge problems? And in the meantime, they might be in a lot of pain, for instance, while they're waiting for their medication. And even for the patients that have a good understanding of their condition from day one, there are still gaps that occur. For instance, you have patients that they think they know everything, but they may necessarily not know everything, or they're taking their medication only when they feel bad. And of course, that leads to certain problems as well. So I'd like to transition into how Tria differs from prioritization processes. Currently, we have a framework where we have prioritizations in place. And yes, those are very important to ensure that medications are used for their approved conditions and under appropriate circumstances. Very important to manage utilization. But typical prioritization, when we look at the indication, what it's being used for, the age of the patient, past treatment experience, maybe they want them to try one less expensive option, for instance, before treatment. And some of them will screen for certain infectious diseases that can be dangerous. But at Tria, we're able to make a much more holistic approach. Yes, we'll check the prioritization requirements, for instance, indication, age, all that good stuff. Make sure that it's being used appropriately as a double check. But we'll check much more than that. We'll kind of delve into how the patient is coping with the disease and see what their thoughts are on treatment. Do they have a good understanding of their condition? Do they have a good understanding of their medication? We'll go over how to use the medication, when to use it, make sure that actually is administered appropriately, which can be tricky with several medications requiring either self-injections or infusions in a lot of cases. Are they being efficient with how they use it? Are we managing other problems that could arise throughout treatment? Not just, for instance, rheumatoid arthritis, but are we managing their cardiovascular risk effectively? Are we reducing their chances of having a heart attack? In addition to managing the rheumatoid arthritis, depression, extremely common in any sort of chronic disease, lowers all outcomes and is often overlooked as a marker for disease worsening. Are we managing concerns that the drugs can cause themselves? For instance, are they up to date on the vaccine? Certain vaccines are recommended and often overlooked with some of our medications that affect the immune system. And are we taking appropriate precautions? Are we making this drug really fit with the patient's life? Are we making sure they know how to dispose of it? How they store it? And are we coming up with strategies if they have any problems, for instance, travel, as an example? And adherence, like most chronic conditions, is a big problem in specialty. Not so much in the first few months, but especially about that 6-month mark, you'll see adherence drop to about 50%. 50% of patients are using their medication as prescribed over 80% of the time at the 6-month mark. And that drops to about a third at the 2-year mark. That means there's about 1 week every month where the patient is not covered by their medication, and of course leads to concerns about whenever these conditions flare up or worsen. It's also important because there is such a high degree of variability. A lot can go wrong in that first year or two. A lot can go wrong throughout treatment, but particularly in the first year or two, where we'll see something go wrong. Only about 30% of patients remain adherent and remain on the same biologic that was initially prescribed at the same dose and considered effectively treated at the 1-year mark. That drops down to 15% at the 2-year mark. So there's a decent chance in that first year we'll either have to change medications, we'll have to change doses, will have to address adherence concerns, or they will have some sort of poor outcome. They're just not responding to treatment, and we need to get that switched as well before we spend thousands of dollars on an ineffective treatment. And that's kind of where those validated scales come into play. So we measure before and after, if you will. So at the time of prior authorization approval, 1 month, 3 month, 6 month, 9 month, 12 month, especially for that first year, make sure that the disease is responding, but also that that response is maintained over time. And if there are problems that are arising, that we can address them as soon as possible. The sooner we get patients off ineffective medications, for instance, or the sooner we get those medications used in the first place, the more money we will actually end up saving, and the more outcomes will improve as a result. So the underuse of specialty medications is a big problem. Arguably more so than some other conditions, because a flare-up in a specialty condition, for instance, rheumatoid arthritis, leads to permanent joint damage. And multiple sclerosis, it can lead to disease progression. It can lead to accumulated disability that may never repair itself. It can be a very dangerous proposition, and we want to make sure these patients aren't setting themselves up for problems down the line by not using their medications effectively, or, as you'll see often, just from personal experience, where they're only using it until they feel better and then they stop, or use it less frequently for one reason or another. Cardiovascular disease is a huge problem with inflammatory conditions, in particular. Poorly controlled inflammation is systemic, and of course it puts a lot of stress on the heart. And the worse your rheumatoid arthritis is, the higher your risk of cardiovascular disease. And it may sound counterintuitive that these medications aren't being used as much, but we actually end up spending a lot more money on patients that aren't using them as often. And this comes from a variety of studies that have shown that patients that aren't as adherent end up costing the plan more in the long run. Not so much from the medication expenditures, but more so from increased specialist visits, increased ER visits. We're having to treat their flare every few months, maybe every month even. And that, of course, racks up a large bill, more so than had they just used their specialty medication long term. Switching gears for a moment to hepatitis C, fortunately, in this arena, we see a lot better adherence rates, around 90, 95, sometimes 97% adherent throughout duration of treatment, which is encouraging because the adherence rates, it's important to take your hep C medication every day in order to attain that cure that we're all going for. But you have even one patient that doesn't understand that they need to take their medication for the entire duration of treatment, and of course can be very costly, a very costly mistake. Not only do you have to likely retreat that patient, but you'll probably have to treat them with a more expensive agent and for a longer duration in some circumstances. Drug interactions are, of course, huge in hepatitis C as well, and can greatly affect treatment course and result in less effective treatment. Right, and I would like to get into the most cited reasons why people stop their medication for one reason or another. So the most common one is lack of perceived effectiveness, and this is a big one in the specialty world. This is where those validated scales, for instance, RAPID-3 for rheumatoid arthritis, the Harvey-Bradshaw for Crohn's disease, what have you, come into play. So we're able to validate treatment over time and make sure that drug remains effective. And if it is a true loss of response, then we're able to switch that sooner rather than later, so we can stop wasting several $1,000s on medication that's just not working for the patient. Part of this also is managing expectations, particularly in the first few months of treatment. These medications, like many preventative medications, take a while to kick in. Usually 8 to 12 weeks is kind of the minimum for that. And the patient needs to understand that it's not going to happen overnight, most likely, but to give it enough time. And managing medication beliefs is paramount here as well. So how is the patient coping? The classic example would be that the patient completes 1 month of hepatitis C treatment, lab results come back, they didn't find any virus. We have very effective medications, encouraging, but our lab tests also can miss virus particles, and doesn't mean necessarily that they are clinically cured, especially in the case of hepatitis C. So it's important that they understand they need to complete the entire duration of treatment, make sure that yes, indeed, we've actually gotten rid of the entire virus, and it's okay to stop at that point. There are concerns about long-term safety that can greatly affect adherence rates as well. For instance, I don't know if you've opened up the package insert for one of our TNF inhibitors, like Humira and Enbrel. But if you do, you'll see in big, bold, black letters, warning, serious infection and malignancy. And if you stop reading right there, the only conclusion you can come to is that you're going to get sick, get cancer, and die. And of course, that's just not the case with Humira, but it is a concern that's on patients' minds. It doesn't always get brought up in the doctor's office. It doesn't always get adequately brought up in other settings as well. But of course, we're able to see how they're seeing the medication and what is concerning them. And in many cases, we're able to mitigate these risks. For instance, infections can be prevented by vaccines. In some cases, it's as simple as holding off on Humira when you're feeling sick, or other medications that could progress that could suppress the immune system and make a cold progress into pneumonia. But that doesn't always get communicated to patients quite as well as it otherwise could have been. And malignancy, for instance, there are screening tools available, and this risk was only seen with a certain population, particularly like inflammatory bowel disease, and mostly in children and adolescents in those cases as well. The needle fatigue with self-injections is, of course, a big one, and this happens with all settings, but I attribute a lot of it to the 6-month drop in adherence. This is about the point where patients are feeling better, they're starting to improve quite a bit, and they're getting tired of injecting themselves with the medication. So catching that when it happens, and seeing if there's ways we can address that, make the medication easier to inject. Sometimes it's as simple as making sure that they're letting it warm up before they inject it. Don't inject it straight out of the refrigerator. Making sure that they're using a good device. Some people find that the auto-injector devices are just too violent and hurt more, but they do well on the syringe, which they're given a little more control over how quickly it's injected. So things like that can really go a long way to improve those adherence. And then finally, there's a lack of medical and social support in this sector. I think particularly in the beginning, there's a good amount of support, but that support's lost over time, unfortunately, especially after about 6 months again. And I think that's why you'll see a big cutoff there. But we're able to give that support here at Tria through frequent touch points. But patients have things come up, like some of these medications have storage conditions that have to be adhered to, but they're busy, they travel a lot, and they don't know how to work the medication into their daily life. And we can certainly help with that. A lot of these medications have extended stability information. There are certain ways you should travel with them, and we can certainly go over that with them as well. There are, of course, formulary changes that occur throughout time. Difficult decisions have to be made, and sometimes one medication is preferred over the other. And helping the patient navigate both the formulary, what is preferred now, and how this is going to affect them, what they should keep an eye out for throughout that is a huge point, especially as we move into some of this change that could happen, especially going forward here. And then there is the site of care aspect as well. So we have more and more self-administration options as opposed to intravenous options, which are a lot more convenient to patients, but they may not always be aware that these are options that may be equivalent to them and just make their life a little bit easier and make the medication easier to administer with that. And then finally, I'd like to end on a patient case where we had a patient who was working with us. He was on Enbrel, had diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. He'd been working with us for about 6 months at this point. And he informed us that he was diagnosed with non-infectious uveitis. It's not very common, but it is a known complication, likely related to his rheumatoid arthritis in this case. He'd seen the eye doctor. They prescribed him several eye drops. Wasn't really a big fan of using them. They were fairly expensive in themselves. And he just wanted to let us know of it during a follow-up visit with us. After discussing it with him, we knew of another medication, Humira, which has been effective in managing non-infectious uveitis, a common, again, related to his rheumatoid arthritis. But the current medication he's on, Enbrel, has not been shown to be effective. For one reason or another, studies have just failed to show that people improve with it. He hasn't had a chance to see his rheumatologist. It was going to be several months before he's going to get to do so. And difficult to say if he would have brought it up at that point. But I talked with him about this other option, and he was very open to it, and didn't like his eye drops again to begin with. So we got the rheumatologist on board, told him what's going on, got the visit seen sooner, And he was switched to Humira. The uveitis fortunately cleared up. His rheumatoid arthritis remained, again, adequately treated. He was doing excellent. To begin with, didn't have any flare-ups in the switch or anything like that. And as an added bonus, he was able to stop those eye drops and ended up saving a little bit of convenience and a little bit of money from that perspective as well. So overall, just an excellent outcome for this patient.
Awesome. Congratulations on finding and solving that problem for this member. Not only were you able to help him, obviously, from a quality of life perspective, but also saved the plan and him money. So that's awesome. It also kind of illustrates the complexity of these medications for sure. Just want to remind everyone to submit question and answers through the chat function. And as we're waiting for some of the questions to come on in, Tyler, I wanted to just kind of highlight, we both talked a little bit about biosimilars, and I just wanted to highlight, tell us a little bit more about, like, can you help us explain biosimilars, and then also maybe talk about the barriers to acceptance of biosimilars and what you're hearing from patients or challenges that you're seeing.
Sure. I think biosimilars are great, very exciting going forward here. Basically, they are similar to the reference product, but you have to keep in mind these are very large molecules, very hard to replicate by any manufacturing process. Even the index product has variations in itself. So we have to make sure that if we're going to try to replace it, that the manufacturing process results in a molecule acceptably similar to it. And we do that by testing it actually in crossover studies, where patient will start on the original product, they'll switch to biosimilar, and then they'll switch back and see if there was any change over the course of treatment. And of course, we're hoping no change over several months. And that's what's required for approval. So we have quite a bit of confidence that the biosimilars are going to be effective for these patients, but there is, I suspect, we've seen with other biosimilars, for instance, and that there's going to be a lot of hesitance both from patients and providers to switch over, and a lot of formulary differences that we'll most likely see there too.
Yeah, alignment of formulary right now is really sort of a unique barrier to acceptance of biosimilars, because you're finding that the index or the original products are actually costing less with rebates net. So it's a challenge, I think, and I think it's going to take some experience and time with biosimilars for people to feel comfortable.
Yes, that's absolutely the truth. But we can always help, especially if you have a patient that's struggling financially with it. This might be a worthy avenue to explore. And then there's just the sheer number of biosimilars that are being approved for some of these larger index products and helping them navigate their formulary. I got the right one. You had alluded, you and I've talked before, and you'd said that in some categories, like in the rheumatoid arthritis category with Enbrel and Humira, there's how many? 21 for Humira in the pipeline last time I checked, and they just keep getting more. So.
And obviously we hope that the cost will then, when you have that much competition, you hope that the cost drops, obviously. But due to the fact that these are like really complex proteins that we're replicating a lot of times, they're very large, it costs a lot of money for those pharmaceutical companies to create those. So there's some balance in that for sure. So this kind of brings up a question for me, one more question for me as we're waiting for a couple more questions to come on in. Switching medications. You know, obviously, if we talked about switching a medication because of formulary differences, you know, as we get to an end of a benefit plan year and you're going to either a new PBM or a new formulary, many times, especially in that huge rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory category, they will only have a couple of drugs as the preferred or options in that category. What are some of the challenges, and how are you assisting people when it comes to formulary changes like that, especially when they're controlled and been controlled for a long period of time? What are the conversations, and what are you guys doing to help ensure that the control of that patient is still adequate?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think a lot of it comes down to just more frequent testing as far as making sure it remains effective. Because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing, is that, especially in well-controlled patients, that we maintain that same level of control, both through the patient satisfaction, the provider satisfaction, and testing more frequently becomes key, I believe. You might test a few weeks, a few months into treatment, definitely, to make sure, is this really going to be validated? And just keep a close eye on flares. I don't suspect side effects will change too much, but mostly that efficacy standpoint, it becomes extremely important to test.
And then we've obviously illustrated there are some unique situations where the switches could be clinically not appropriate, and that's where obviously the expertise of a specialty pharmacist, knowing all these complex amounts of medications that are on the market is helpful. So
absolutely, yeah.
So we've received a question here in regards to, can you name some of the drug interactions that you've found in specialty medications? I think obviously excited to hear you talk a little bit about and illustrate for us what our pharmacists are doing outside of just that disease state, especially disease state, and the complexities of that.
Absolutely. And there are some that are, you always have to keep an eye out for. I would say the most common drug interaction that you'll come across would be with acid reflux medications, particularly with hepatitis C treatments, which acid reflux, as we all know, you can get those over the counter fairly easily, but what patients don't always know is that they can reduce how much drug is absorbed and reduce the effectiveness of the medication, thereby affecting their chance of actually being cured of the disease. They don't always tell the doctor about it, and of course that can lead to very poor clinical outcomes. So knowing that that's a question that you need to ask to make sure that that treatment is going to be as effective as possible is a very important one. It doesn't always get asked. I would say one of the more bizarre interactions came to me not too long ago. It was a patient who was on hormone replacement and starting hepatitis C treatment, and there was a drug interaction that would increase the chance of liver damage, ultimately decompensated disease, basically. Very dangerous if it occurred. Basically, it was just an unsafe combination. We talked with her about it, discussed strategies. She was unwilling to stop the hormone replacement. So we had to find a different medication, basically, for hepatitis C. It was kind of frustrating because all the framework had been in place. We were ready to start the medication, but ultimately this would be an unsafe medication for the patient. So we talked with the prescribing doctor, and they agreed, and we got her switched over to a medication that just completely avoided hepatitis C.
That really demonstrates the value of your expertise and the complexity of being a specialty pharmacist. So that's a great example. So speaking of specialty pharmacies, and I think we get this question often, and this question came in, and you're the perfect person to help us answer this question, but it's like, how's Tria different than a specialty pharmacy? What does my specialty pharmacy do? I think helping illustrate sort of the differences between, since you've been in a specialty pharmacy and worked as a specialty pharmacist there, and now that you're here at Tria, can you kind of illustrate the differences to the approach of the medication?
Well, sure. I would say especially in the world of specialty, there is a definite focus on the disease state that we're treating. We're mostly looking at rheumatoid arthritis, or we're mostly looking at Crohn's disease, almost to the exclusion. We're looking for drug interactions to some extent, and it's kind of on us to get a good medication list, but that's not really the focus. But at Tria, we're able to take a much more patient-centered approach, where we can take everything that's going on with the patient, not only how well their psoriasis is controlled, but how well is their depression. Are they at risk of cardiovascular disease? What percent is the risk? What was their last lipid panel looking like? Are they on effective treatment from every perspective that you can imagine? And of course, the drug interactions. Are those medications working well to the patient's satisfaction? I can also tell you just from the specialty world that sometimes these happen after long hold times, these discussions. So the patient might be on a 10, 12-minute hold time and be listening to that music the whole time, and there's very little they want to do after listening to that elevated music for 12 minutes or so. They usually just want to get their medication, get out of there, and hold kind of brief consults. And unfortunately, that leads to gaps and inadequate treatments.
Yeah, and I think that sort of illustrates, for Tria, the specialty pharmacies are obviously the dispensing function. But from a pharmacist perspective, Tria pharmacists are definitely more holistic, patient-oriented conversations versus the transactional nature of conversations that occur in specialty pharmacy, which is really revolving around dispensing. And obviously the other pieces of information that you illustrated as well. Can you there's a question that's coming in from someone, and they are asking specifically as it relates to engagement. And what they were wondering was, as a broker, we love the philosophy behind Tria Health. The biggest hurdle continues to be getting members engaged, since you can't require them to use the program. What things have been most successful at getting good engagement? Obviously, our plan sponsors are encouraged to use multitude of different incentives to try to get people in the conversation, and we use obviously an incentive card, like a $50 Visa reward card for engaging initially, or wellness points, or maybe a reduction in copays. But can you talk a little bit about other reasons why people engage, or things that also come from the enhancements of engagements with your interactions with patients?
Absolutely. And I think that's good for getting their foot in the door. But once they really start talking with us and reviewing these medications, from my experience, they've really appreciated how thorough we are with all of the disease states, not just making sure that this is well controlled, but making sure that's well controlled, and this is well controlled, and this is working well with that, and what have you. And so those sorts of interactions, I think, keep patients engaged, that there is someone who actually cares about everything, and making sure that it's another time point, of course, for making sure that rheumatoid arthritis is controlled, for instance, but it's a time point to make sure that we're also reducing their level of their risk of heart disease, as a common example, and making sure that any drugs that they start on aren't going to interact, and they can always, we're always just a phone call away if they ever had a question about that. Also, vaccines, of course, that there are ways to prevent these illnesses and populations that tend to be a little more susceptible to illnesses to begin with.
Yeah, and having that unique opportunity to have one-on-one focused time with an expert in medications is a unique opportunity that's not afforded in all aspects of healthcare. So
Correct. Yeah.
It's great. One last question here I wanted to ask you. This question comes in and says, what are the biggest drugs on the horizon that you believe will impact future costs? So put on your future perspective and tell us what's going to happen.
Certainly. And I think those biosimilars are going to be a big thing in the next decade or so. But I think, especially if you look at the new approvals, a lot of them are for oncology agents, so cancer, and especially oral oncology. As we get better and better, fortunately, at treating different kinds of cancers, it becomes more and more like a chronic disease. And of course, those patients are having, those therapies aren't always the best tolerated, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong in that kind of sphere of treatment. So helping those patients manage, I think, is going to be a big deal in the coming decade as well.
Yeah, and we see that the pipeline obviously is continuing to expand in those really targeted areas, specific cancer drugs that are targeting specific types of cancer, and all very exciting, but cost is going to continue to be a conversation, and we need to ensure that people are getting what they expect out of these drugs for sure, not only from the member perspective, but from the plan sponsor perspective as well. Well, thanks, Tyler, for your expertise today. Obviously, I'm super proud to have you as a member of our staff. You've provided a great opportunity to show how well our pharmacists are helping members in the specialty arena, and I appreciate that. Thanks for joining our webinar today. We obviously want to let you know that this has been recorded. Should you want to hear it or need to share it again, we hope you found it informative. If you have further questions, please feel free to reach out to any Tria member who may be able to help you understand a little bit more about Tria and the opportunities we provide. Please follow us on our social channels and our blog. Thank you so much and have a great day.